this is the light portion of Unit 4. When we talk about just light in general, this is where the light comes from. This is the explanation of what's happening in the atom. So if we add energy to an atom, what happens is the electrons that are spinning around the nucleus, they get excited, and then they jump up to an orbital or a ring, if you will, higher away or further away from the nucleus. When they return back to their original location, there is a release of energy that occurs, and that release of energy comes out in the form of light. Sometimes it's colored, and that's what we see. So we did a lab where we sprayed different solutions into the flame, and we observed how they produce different colors of light. So here's kind of a picture. In black, I've drawn my atom, and here in blue is my little electron. And so this electron is spinning around the nucleus. And then if we shoot some energy in, whether that comes from like some sort of light source or by a flame, that electron can absorb some of that energy, and when it absorbs that energy, it jumps up. If the energy is enough to make it jump really far away, it will do that. If it's only enough to make it jump maybe one ring, it will do that. But it jumps up to a location that's further away from the nucleus. And eventually that electron has to return to what we call ground state, or come back to where it came from. And so when it does that, it releases energy, or it emits energy, and the electron falls back down. And this energy that is emitted, depending on the amount of energy it is, can come out in the form of all different kinds of light, and sometimes it's in the visible region of the spectrum where we can see it as a particular color. So the color of the light given off by the electron corresponds, or it indicates, the amount of energy that was absorbed when it jumps to the higher orbital, and it's also going to be equal to the amount of energy that it emits. So the amount of energy that's absorbed to get it up to the higher orbital is equal to the amount of energy that's released when it falls back down, because the law of conservation of energy says that those two things have to be equivalent to each other. And we have an equation that we can use, mathematically speaking, to calculate the amount of energy depending upon really just this one variable, frequency. So in this equation, E is energy measured in joules. N is what we call the number of photons. That's not protons. So if light was a particle, this would be the number of particles of light. Or if like light was packaged into little parcels, this is what a photon is. H is a constant, which means it is always, always, always the same number. So anytime we use this equation, we will always plug the same number in for H, and that is 6.63 times 10 to the negative 34. And then F is called frequency. Frequency is the number of times a wave passes a given point, a fixed point, each second. And so the units of frequency are either measured in hertz or s to the -1. And both of those units mean the same thing. So here's an example that I've done. What is the total energy of 1,500 yellow photons if the frequency of yellow photons is 5.17 times 10 to the 14? So we plug this in. N is 1,500 for 1,500 photons. H is always 6.63 times 10 to the negative 34. And frequency was provided, 5.17 times 10 to the 14. And you just multiply those three values together to get 5.1 times 10 to the negative 16. This one's a little tougher because it says how many red photons of that particular frequency would it take to equal the energy of 10,000 violet photons of that particular energy. Hello. Sorry, I had to take a phone call. Okay, back to this. So what we know is that energy for the red has to equal energy for the violet. And so if we set energy for the red equal to energy for the violet, it's the same as saying N times H times F for the red equals N times H times F for the violet, which is what I've done here. and then I just kind of plug in all the numbers of the variables that are provided to me in this word problem. So N, where I wrote NR, that's really the thing that I'm solving for. It says how many red photons. So I'm solving for N as it pertains to the red. H is always this number, and F is the frequency of the red photons, which is given to me here. And this is equal to 10,000, which is N, but as it pertains to violet, and there's H again, which is always the same, and there's F as it pertains to the violet photons. So those two sides of this equation are equal to each other. And then from there, it's just manipulating the algebra to get N by itself. And I come up with this as my final answer. I strongly encourage you to maybe pause this and then, without looking at this, see if you can work through that on your own to see that we agree with our answers there. Another thing we've talked about is this thing called spectroscopy. And what spectroscopy is really just the study of how light and matter interact with each other. And there's two types of spectroscopy. There's what's called absorption spectroscopy and emission spectroscopy. In absorption spectroscopy, we shoot all colors of light on a sample. That's what this means. Light is incident on a sample. So we shine like the entire rainbow on a sample. And that sample is going to absorb some of those colors. So when it absorbs some of those colors, we measure the light that passes through the sample, and the missing light, which is equal to the colors that was absorbed, is determined. And so we get something that looks like this. And I know this is a difficult picture to see, but if you can imagine, this is Roy G. Biv, the rainbow across this bar, and then there's a couple black lines in there. Those black lines correspond to the missing light, which means that's the color of light that was absorbed by the sample. And then in emission spectroscopy, we take something and we get it energized, which makes the electrons jump back and forth between the excited and the ground state. And as a result of that, we get light produced. And then what happens is each individual atom produces a very unique set of lines. So up here, if you can imagine, this is just a black bar, and these lines are colored, but they're different colors depending on where they fall in the Roy G. Biv region of the rainbow. So like down here, this line is red, and then this is more like in the green area, and then the further we get down here, we're getting into the violet, so we have maybe like a purplish line down here. But each individual element produces a set of colored lines that is unique to only that element. So for example, nitrogen produces an emission spectrum that looks like this. It has 3 lines in these locations, and I've got these labeled with what's called wavelength. So these numbers are their wavelengths, and nitrogen is the only element that produces these 3 lines of those 3 wavelengths. So if I don't know what's in something, so like I got an emission spectrum right here, and it contains some stuff that is unknown to me, all I have to do is make a comparison to known spectra. So since I know that nitrogen looks like this, I compare. And what I find is that all 3 of these lines are indeed present here, which tells me that nitrogen is part of whatever is this unknown substance. I also know that it's more than just nitrogen because there's other lines present. So down here I've got carbon and iron. I can go through and look, and I find that all 6 of these lines for carbon are also here in this unknown, which tells me this unknown also contains carbon. There's other lines in here other than the nitrogen and the carbon lines, so I know that there has to be something else in this unknown. So if I check iron, there's a line here at 392. There is not a line at 392 over here, which tells me that there is no iron in this because all the lines have to match. So it's really just a sense of logic, like identifying these. I'm going to attach some samples for you to practice by. It's called spectral star analysis. So there are 10 samples and they're labeled A1 through A5 and B1 through B5. And then there's a set of knowns, and you just have to make a comparison to figure out what is in the star. So when you look at A1 and then you compare it to the knowns, you can identify what's in the star. Then we've also talked about the electromagnetic spectrum. I suggest you pause the video, take a minute to color this in. I have attached this into the Google Classroom. So this picture. So this is Roy G. Biv, Colors of the Rainbow. That is the only portion that we can actually see is in the visible range of the electromagnetic spectrum. There are different kinds of radiation, going from radio, microwave, infrared. Then we have our visible area, ultraviolet, X-ray, gamma. It is important that you understand the relationship that they have with frequency, wavelength, and energy. And what I mean by that is where there's a low frequency, we have long wavelengths, meaning the waves are far apart. This is the low energy end of the spectrum. Where there's a high frequency, it means that the waves are really close together. This is the high energy end of the spectrum. So you can expect a question that says something along the lines of, list the divisions of the electromagnetic spectrum in order of decreasing energy. So if I'm talking about decreasing energy, then you need to tell me that it's gamma, X-ray, ultraviolet, visible, infrared, microwave, radio. You need to be able to put them in the correct order. This right here is a little memory tool to help you remember that the order that they go in from low energy to high energy. Red Martians invade Venus using X-ray guns. So a little more in depth about the electromagnetic spectrum. There are 2 experiments that give us evidence about how light behaves. The first one, it was done by a guy named Young. I suggest that you watch the video that I link about Young's experiment, talking about a wave. I find it interesting. But anyways, his experiment showed that there was evidence that light behaves like a wave. There was a second experiment called the photoelectric effect that provided evidence that light acts like a particle. And so since it can do both of these things, we say that light has wave-particle duality. Radio waves are used to excite the nucleus. When you're listening to the radio in your car, you tune your radio into a particular frequency. That's what the numbers mean, like 106.1 megahertz. That's the frequency. So that radio station is broadcasting waves that are only at that particular frequency, and you've set your car to receive that frequency of information flying through the air. So that's why you can hear that radio station. Microwaves cause rotation in molecules. So when the molecules are rotating around the bonds, they create friction, which is how our food gets hot. Infrared rays cause vibration in the molecules. Infrared rays are how like your remote controls work. Visible light is the only portion of the spectrum that you can actually see with your eye. UV rays, we can use these to sanitize instruments. X-rays, they ionize atoms, which means it causes them to lose or gain electrons. They're strong enough or energetic enough to penetrate soft tissue. That's why we can use them to take pictures of our bones underneath our muscles and skin. And then gamma rays, they can actually be harmful to you. They're damaging to your cells. However, if we have cells that we want to damage, like cancer cells, then we can use them to target those kind of things. This is the other equation that you'll have to use at times in this unit. So c is the speed of light. It's another constant. All light travels at this speed, so anytime you're using this equation, you will be using this number plugged in for c. This is an upside down Y looking thing. This is a Greek letter called lambda, but this is what we use to represent wavelength, which is measured in meters. And then F again is frequency. It is very common for our wavelengths to be given to us in nanometers. And so nanometer is 1 × 10⁻⁹ meter. You'll have to make those conversions because you cannot plug nanometer into this equation. It has to be meters. So here's an example. What is the frequency and energy of 750 nanometer red light? I've only done the frequency portion here, but I'll do the energy for you as well. So if I rearrange this equation to solve for frequency, I get C over wavelength. So I plug C in. It's always 3 × 10⁸ over wavelength, which was given to me 750 nanometers. And since this has to be in meters, it's really easy. All you have to do is put a times 10⁻⁹ at the end to go from nanometers to meters. And then you just divide to get your answer. Once you know the frequency, which I think was 4.0 × 10⁻⁴, and this is hertz, you can go on to solve for your energy because E equals NHF. N, if it doesn't tell you, then you can make the assumption that N is 1. So we'll say N is 1. H is that 6.63 × 10⁻34. And F is what we just solved for. So 4.0 × 10⁻14 hertz. And then you simply multiply through to get your energy in joules. And that is it. So now you should be able to do the rest of that UT Quest 4.1 because it includes nuclear and then these two equations, this one and this one.